A subtle mental loop that keeps you exactly where you are. I didn't realize I was stuck because nothing around me looked broken. My life still moved forward in small, convincing ways. Days passed, messages were answered, bills were paid. I made plans, I canceled them. I thought about change often enough to believe it counted as progress. That's how the loop hid. It didn't trap me with fear. It didn't paralyze me with despair. It kept me comfortable. The first sign was a sentence I kept telling myself. I'll deal with this once things calm down. It sounded responsible, mature, patient. I didn't question it. Why would I? Everyone waits for the right moment. Everyone believes in timing. What I didn't notice was that things never actually calmed down. There was always something small and reasonable standing in the way. A responsibility, a distraction, a reason that made sense on its own. The loop didn't say no, it said later. I began to notice how often my thoughts returned to the same unresolved points. Not obsessively, not dramatically, casually. I would think about changing my routine, about reaching out to someone I'd been avoiding, about leaving a situation that no longer fit. The thought would form clearly, convincingly, and then dissolve. Not dismissed, deferred. Another thought would immediately follow, quieter and calmer. Now isn't the right time. And just like that, the discomfort disappeared. That relief felt like wisdom. The loop worked because it mimicked self-awareness. It made me feel reflective without requiring action. I analyzed myself constantly. My motivations, my fears, my patterns. I knew all the language: growth, healing, readiness. I understood myself perfectly. I just never moved. At some point, I stopped noticing how often my internal dialogue circled the same territory, the same conclusions, the same cautions, the same careful postponements. Any time a thought threatened to move beyond reflection and into decision, the loop tightened slightly. Not enough to hurt, just enough to redirect. The scariest part wasn't the repetition. It was how reasonable it all sounded. The loop didn't argue with me, it agreed with me. It validated my concerns, supported my caution, praised my patience. It told me I was being smart. I remember the first time I felt something was wrong. It wasn't during a crisis. It was during a quiet moment, standing alone in my kitchen, staring at nothing in particular. A thought surfaced suddenly, without build-up. How long have you been thinking about the same things? The question lingered. I tried to answer it. I couldn't. Not because I didn't know, but because the answer felt slippery. Like trying to measure time inside a room with no clocks. That night, I paid closer attention to my thoughts. I noticed how often they began the same way. Once I figured this out, after things settle, when I'm more prepared, each sentence promised motion. None of them contained it. The loop wasn't a single thought. It was a structure. A mental architecture designed to keep everything exactly as it was while convincing me I was almost somewhere else. I tried to disrupt it deliberately. The next time a familiar hesitation appeared, I pushed past it. I made a small, impulsive choice. Nothing drastic, just enough to test the resistance. The resistance arrived instantly, not as fear, not as panic, as logic. A flood of reasons why this was unnecessary, premature, inefficient, poorly timed. The arguments were so clean, so persuasive, that stopping felt like intelligence. Continuing felt reckless. I stopped. The relief was immediate and deeply unsettling. That's when I understood something crucial. The loop wasn't passive. It was active. It wasn't simply keeping me still. It was intervening. Every time momentum began to form, the loop intercepted it, reframed it, and returned me to a familiar mental position. I wasn't failing to move. I was being redirected. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how the same realizations returned again and again, always stopping just short of action. How insights recycled themselves without evolving. How self-awareness became a closed circuit instead of a path forward. I was learning the same lessons repeatedly, perfectly, uselessly. The loop thrived on insight without consequence. It let me feel intelligent, insightful, self-aware. It just never let me leave. I started to wonder how long it had been there. Not days, not months, years. Entire phases of my life passed while I stayed mentally engaged but physically unchanged. Relationships stalled, opportunities decayed quietly, desires softened into abstractions. I told myself this was maturity. The loop encouraged that belief. The realization didn't arrive dramatically. There was no breakdown, no panic, just a quiet, nauseating clarity. I wasn't waiting for the right time. The loop was waiting for me to stop noticing. Once I recognized the loop, I expected it to weaken. That's what people say about awareness, that once you see a pattern clearly, it loses power. That insight is a kind of liberation. That's a lie the loop loves. Because awareness doesn't break it, awareness feeds it. At first, the loop reacted to my attention with subtlety. It softened. It adopted a more reflective tone. Instead of delaying action outright, it reframed in more sophisticated ways. This deserves deeper thought. Rushing would undermine the insight. You're close. Don't disrupt the process now. The language evolved. It sounded wiser. I noticed that every time I tried to act quickly, the loop slowed time internally. Thoughts stretched, considerations multiplied. Every possible outcome demanded evaluation. The urgency dissolved into analysis. I would sit with a decision for hours that should have taken minutes. By the time I finished thinking, the moment had passed. The loop never said stop. It waited for time to do the work. Something else changed too. The loop began to anticipate me. Thoughts I hadn't fully formed were answered before they completed. Doubts were neutralized before they became uncomfortable. I would feel a flicker of dissatisfaction, and immediately a justification would arrive, smoothing it over. It felt like being managed, gently, constantly. I realized then that the loop wasn't reactive anymore. It was predictive. The more I tried to name it, the harder it became to separate it from my own thinking. Was this caution or the loop? Was this patience or delay? Was this wisdom or fear disguised as maturity? The distinctions blurred, and the loop exploited that blur mercilessly. I tried to define a single concrete action, something small but decisive, a line I would cross no matter what. The loop responded by turning the action abstract. What does decisive really mean? Isn't change more sustainable when it's gradual? Why force clarity when complexity exists for a reason? By the end, I wasn't even sure what I had planned to do, only that I had thought about it very deeply. That's when I understood the loop's real function. It wasn't keeping me from acting. It was keeping me thinking instead of acting, endlessly, safely. The loop thrived on potential. As long as everything remained hypothetical, nothing had to change. I could imagine different versions of myself without committing to any of them. I could rehearse futures that never arrived. The loop kept every door technically open, just never reachable. I began noticing the emotional cost, not despair, not panic, erosion, a slow flattening of desire. Motivation softened, urgency disappeared. Everything felt equally important and therefore equally deferrable. The loop didn't kill ambition. It neutralized it. One night, lying awake, I tried to remember the last time I had made a decision that surprised me. Something unplanned, unanalyzed, something that felt like movement instead of refinement. The memory wouldn't come, not because it didn't exist, because the loop didn't allow access to it. The realization landed heavily. The loop wasn't just a mental habit. It was a containment system. It contained risk. It contained uncertainty. It contained versions of me that might act without permission. And in doing so, it slowly replaced identity with process. I wasn't someone moving through life. I was a system managing internal states. The loop began to speak more directly after that, not in words exactly, but in conclusions that felt final. There's no rush. This isn't necessary. Stability matters more than change. Each conclusion carried a subtle threat. Deviation would result in discomfort, anxiety, regret, loss of control. The loop had trained me to associate stillness with safety. I tried to imagine breaking free, not practically, mentally. I pictured myself acting without internal review. choosing without justification, moving before thought caught up. The image produced immediate resistance, a tightness in my chest. A thought surfaced instantly, sharp and cold. That's reckless. The word echoed. Reckless. As if movement itself were a danger. That was the moment fear finally arrived. Not fear of failure, fear of freedom. The loop had succeeded in something far more profound than keeping me still. It had convinced me that movement was irresponsible, that action without exhaustive thought was a threat, that certainty was naive, and that staying exactly where I was wisdom. I began to notice how often the loop framed itself as protection. This prevents mistakes. This avoids unnecessary pain. This keeps you safe. Safe from what? The answer was never explicit, because the danger wasn't external, it was internal. The danger was becoming someone else, someone unpredictable, someone capable of disruption, someone who might make irreversible choices. The loop existed to prevent that. Once I understood this, I saw the loop everywhere, in how I spoke, in how I planned, in how I postponed. I realized I had confused preparation with progress for years, that I had mistaken clarity for courage, that I had replaced action with analysis so completely that they felt interchangeable. They weren't. The worst part was how satisfied the loop felt. There was no urgency in it, no desperation, just calm certainty, like something that knew it had already won. One evening, I sat alone and deliberately tried to sit with discomfort. No analysis, no reframing, no conclusions, just feeling. The loop intervened immediately. Thoughts rushed in, structured and persuasive, explaining why this exercise was pointless, why discomfort without direction was wasteful, why I should stop. I stayed. The pressure increased, not panic, not pain, control. I realized then that the loop wasn't just mental. It had embedded itself into my nervous system. My body reacted to stillness outside the loop as if it were danger. That's when I knew the truth. The loop didn't keep me where I was by accident. It kept me there because it was designed to, by me, over years, one reasonable delay at a time. And now, even knowing this, I wasn't sure how to leave, because the loop didn't feel like a prison. It felt like home,